The morning he got fired, Ethan Cole didn't shout, didn't argue, didn't beg. He just stood there in the glass-walled office, the one he'd spent 6 years trying to earn a spot in, and listened to every word that fell from Martin Greaves' smug mouth. It was a short speech, the kind Martin liked to give when he was trying to sound decisive. Something about budget cuts, department restructuring, and nothing personal. But the smirk in his eyes said otherwise. Martin had been waiting for this. He had found his scapegoat, the perfect distraction for the board, the shareholders, and the press. Ethan, the loyal employee who had started as a data analyst and worked his way up to operations manager. Ethan had seen too much. He knew about the phantom contracts, the inflated invoices, the offshore accounts cleverly tucked under the guise of consulting services. He had kept records, quietly, carefully, because something in him had always known that one day it might matter. But that morning, all he did was nod. He handed over his access badge, his laptop, and the little potted plant that had sat on his desk for years. The HR rep avoided his eyes, clearly uncomfortable. Martin didn't even pretend to feel bad. He just said, "Good luck out there, Ethan," and turned away, already checking his phone. Outside, the city was gray and damp, the kind of day where everything seemed to echo loss. Ethan walked until the building disappeared behind him, until his reflection in a shop window didn't look like a man who'd just been humiliated. He went home, made himself a cup of coffee, and opened his laptop, the old one, the one no one from work had access to. Then, he opened a folder labeled Project Titan. The folder contained years of quietly gathered evidence, bank statements, internal memos, confidential emails, and transaction trails that pointed to one undeniable truth. Martin Greaves had built his empire on lies. Ethan had uncovered enough to bury him 10 times over. He just hadn't decided what to do with it. Until now. For 2 days, Ethan planned. He knew the company's systems inside out, every firewall, every vulnerability. He also knew the board's blind spots, their routines, and their desperation to keep profits high. He didn't want money, not anymore. What he wanted was truth. Exposure. On the third night, he acted. At 2:17 a.m., while the city slept and the office servers ran their nightly updates, Ethan slipped through the company's digital defenses like a ghost. He didn't destroy anything, he was smarter than that. Instead, he copied. He mirrored entire databases, leaving no trace. Emails, audits, wire transfers, shell company registrations, everything was now on his encrypted drive. The next morning, the company's PR department received an anonymous tip, a leak pointing to a series of financial irregularities involving the CEO. Within hours, journalists began to circle. By noon, one of the largest financial news outlets had published an exposé with a headline that made Martin Greaves' blood run cold. Corruption in the boardroom. Greaves Tech CEO implicated in multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. The company's stock plummeted. Board members went into panic mode. Internal investigations were launched. Ethan watched it all unfold from his apartment, sipping coffee, his face unreadable. But he wasn't done. He had one more move, the one Martin would never see coming. He sent a private message to the Federal Financial Crimes Division. Inside was a single sentence and a link. "You'll find everything you need to end Greaves Tech's corruption here." Attached was a secure drive with all the evidence, neatly organized, time-stamped, and cross-referenced. Within a week, federal agents raided the company headquarters. Martin Greaves was arrested in the middle of a board meeting, his expensive suit wrinkled, his face pale as cameras flashed outside. His mugshot was plastered across every major outlet in the country by nightfall. The fallout was nuclear. Greaves Tech's board dissolved. Several executives resigned. Whistleblower protections were hurriedly discussed in government hearings. And somewhere in the chaos, an anonymous insider, the one who had made it all possible, became a legend whispered about in corporate circles. Ethan never came forward. He didn't need recognition. Watching the system crumble under the weight of its own deceit was enough. Months later, he sat in a small cafe near the river, reading a newspaper headline announcing Martin's 25-year sentence. He smiled faintly, not out of joy, but closure. He folded the paper neatly and left a generous tip on the table before walking out into the crisp morning air. The world moved on, as it always did. But in the hushed corridors of power, where men like Martin once thought themselves untouchable, a quiet fear took root. The fear of the one employee who knew too much, who refused to stay silent, and who had proved that sometimes revenge wasn't about rage. It was about justice served in silence. Months had passed since the fall of Greaves Tech, yet the tremors of what Ethan had set in motion still rippled through the corporate world. Every news channel had once blared Martin Greaves' downfall like a victory chant, the billionaire CEO who had stood on stages preaching integrity, now reduced to a cautionary tale. But for Ethan, there was no parade, no applause. He had disappeared quietly, blending back into the hum of the city, another face among millions. He found work under a different name, freelance consulting for small businesses, remote jobs that didn't require a past. He liked it that way. Anonymity was freedom. Yet sometimes, in the quiet of night, when the world was still and the coffee on his desk had gone cold, the old thoughts returned. Not guilt, not regret, but a question that gnawed at him. Was it over? Because the truth was, the rot in Greaves Tech hadn't been born with Martin Greaves. Martin was just the head of a hydra. The deeper Ethan had dug, the more names he'd seen. Partners, subsidiaries, lobbyists, all connected by thin, invisible threads of corruption. Martin had been the face, not the foundation. And though the world had celebrated his fall, those other faces had simply reshuffled their cards, moving money, changing hands, building new fronts under new names. The system had survived. That realization came to Ethan one night as he sat by his window, watching rain streak across the glass. He had spent years believing that justice, once triggered, would spread like fire. But fire needed fuel, and corruption had learned how to starve it. So he made a decision, one colder, sharper than revenge. He began to build something. It started as a single encrypted network, a place for whistleblowers to upload data anonymously. Then he layered it with hidden protocols, dark web access points, AI-assisted verification tools to separate truth from rumor. He called it Helios, after the sun god who saw all things. Helios became his new obsession. Every night, he coded until dawn, driven by a quiet fury. Soon, files began trickling in from employees, journalists, even hackers. Scandals that had been buried for years surfaced in fragments. Illegal labor practices, insider trading, tax fraud. Ethan vetted them all, connecting dots, verifying sources. Within months, Helios had turned into something bigger than he'd ever planned. People whispered about it online, the ghost network, the Eye of Helios. And every time another corporation stumbled under public scrutiny, every time another executive resigned citing personal reasons, Ethan knew the light was spreading. But with light came danger. One evening, while checking through an encrypted batch of new data, Ethan noticed something off, a trace ping, faint but deliberate, embedded deep in a metadata packet. Someone had tried to track him. He froze. His systems were airtight. Whoever had planted that trace wasn't an amateur. It had to be someone with government-level access, or worse, someone from the same network of power he was exposing. That night, he packed a small bag, destroyed his hard drives, and vanished again. New name, new city, new laptop. Helios went dark for a week, long enough for his enemies to think he'd been silenced. Then, without warning, it flickered back online from a new source. Ethan watched from a distance as headlines reappeared. Anonymous data leak exposes lobbyist ties to offshore bribery. Tech giant under fire for environmental fraud. Helios strikes again. Each new revelation was a blade drawn from the shadows. Each fall from grace sent another message to the world. Corruption had a price, and someone was still keeping score. The system tried to adapt. New cybersecurity task forces formed. Politicians condemned Helios publicly, while their aides quietly searched for its creator. Private contractors were hired to trace the leaks. None succeeded. Ethan had learned from the best, from the very corruption he'd dismantled. Years later, somewhere along the northern coast, Ethan Cole sat on a weathered bench overlooking the sea. His beard was thicker now, his hair streaked with gray, but his eyes, steady, calculating, hadn't changed. A small boy chased seagulls nearby, laughing, while the wind tugged at Ethan's coat. In his pocket, his phone buzzed, a new file upload. Another story of deceit waiting to be burned clean by the truth. He smiled faintly, eyes fixed on the horizon where the sky met the restless water. Revenge had been his beginning, but what he'd built was something else entirely, a quiet revolution, born not of anger but of purpose. The world would never know his name, but it would remember his shadow. The man who turned his firing into a movement, who showed that even the smallest voice, if sharpened by injustice, could bring down giants. And as the waves crashed against the rocks below, Ethan whispered to the wind, not in bitterness, but in quiet satisfaction. They fired the wrong man.